The sound of the Silver Dollar's doors slamming shut behind her echoed through the dusty street like a gunshot, final and unforgiving. Rose Murphy stood on the wooden sidewalk, her single carpet bag clutched in white-knuckled hands, watching the last of her options disappear behind painted glass and harsh laughter. Inside, the piano had already resumed its tinkling melody. The dancers had returned to their work, and life continued as if Rose had never existed at all. "Don't come back," Big Jake Morrison had growled as he physically escorted her from the premises, his massive hands surprisingly gentle despite the firmness of his eviction. "I run a business here, not a charity for stubborn women who think they're too good for honest work." Rose had tried to explain that she wasn't too good for honest work, that in fact, she desperately needed any work she could find. But what Jake considered honest, and what Rose could bring herself to do, were apparently two very different things. Dancing with lonely men, accepting their drinks and their wandering hands, smiling and flirting and pretending interest in their slurred compliments. It might have been legal work, but it felt like selling pieces of her soul for coins that would never add up to enough. The irony wasn't lost on her that 6 months ago she had been Mrs. Rose Murphy, wife of a respected schoolteacher, living in a neat cottage with a white picket fence and a garden full of vegetables she had planted with her own hands. Michael had been everything she had dreamed of in a husband, kind, educated, passionate about his work with the children of Copper Creek's growing community. They had been planning to start a family of their own when the fever took him, swift and merciless as a summer storm. The medical bills had taken their savings. The funeral expenses had claimed what little remained. The school board, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that a single woman was unsuitable to continue living in the teacher's cottage, and they had given Rose 30 days to find other accommodations. 30 days to pack up her life and figure out how to survive alone in a world that offered precious few options for women without family or fortune. She had tried everything respectable first. The general store didn't need additional help. The hotel was adequately staffed. The church offered charity but no employment. The few families who could afford domestic help already had arrangements they were satisfied with. One by one, Rose's options had narrowed until only the Silver Dollar remained, the establishment that employed women to entertain men who were far from home and lonely enough to pay for conversation and companionship. Rose had lasted exactly 3 hours before her refusal to dance with a customer who reeked of whiskey and kept trying to pull her toward the back stairs had resulted in her immediate termination. Now she stood in the gathering dusk of a Colorado mining town, with less than $2 to her name and nowhere to sleep, except the church pew that Pastor Williams had discreetly suggested might be available in emergencies. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up from her contemplation of the dust swirls created by evening wind. A man was walking toward her from the direction of the town's business district, his gait unhurried despite the lateness of the hour. As he drew closer, Rose could see that he was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, with the kind of quiet authority that marked him as someone accustomed to making decisions and having them respected. "Miss," he said as he approached, touching the brim of his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I couldn't help but notice your departure from the Silver Dollar. Are you quite all right?" Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized her humiliation had been witnessed by a stranger. "I'm fine, thank you. Just between positions at the moment." The man studied her face with discerning eyes that seemed to see more than Rose was comfortable revealing. "Forgive me, but you don't look fine. You look like someone who's reached the end of a very difficult road and isn't sure which direction to turn next." Rose straightened her shoulders, calling on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she still possessed. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Thornton," the man replied with a slight smile that transformed his rather stern features. "Daniel Thornton. I own the mining operation north of town, among other enterprises. And you are?" "Rose Murphy." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Rose Murphy, though I suppose that distinction doesn't mean much anymore." "On the contrary," Daniel said gently, "it tells me that you've known love and loss, which are experiences that teach valuable lessons about both strength and compassion." He paused, then continued with careful neutrality. "May I ask what brought you to seek employment at the Silver Dollar? It doesn't seem quite your natural habitat." Rose felt tears threaten at the kind tone in his voice, so different from the brusque dismissal she had just received. "It was the only place that would consider hiring me. I've been looking for work since my husband died, but there aren't many options for women in my circumstances." "And what are your circumstances, if you don't mind my asking?" Rose found herself telling this stranger the whole story: Michael's death, the debts, the eviction from the cottage, the gradual elimination of every respectable option until only the silver dollar remained. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as her tale progressed. "So you attempted to work as a dance hall girl," he said when she finished, "but found yourself unable to fulfill the expectations of the position." "I couldn't. I wouldn't." Rose struggled to find words that wouldn't sound self-righteous or judgmental. "I'm not criticizing the women who can do that work. I understand that everyone makes the choices they need to make to survive, but I couldn't bring myself to be what those men wanted me to be." Daniel nodded as if her explanation made perfect sense. "And now you find yourself cast out for maintaining your principles, which leaves you in an even more precarious position than before." "Exactly." Rose felt a mixture of relief and despair at being so clearly understood. "I don't know what I'm going to do next. I've run out of options and nearly run out of money." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Rose's face to the carpet bag in her hands to the gathering darkness of the mountain town around them. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone of someone making an offer he wasn't entirely sure would be accepted. "Mrs. Murphy, I have a proposition for you. It's unconventional, and you may find it unsuitable for reasons of your own, but I believe it might solve both your immediate problem and a difficulty I've been facing in my own household." Rose felt her heart race with hope and apprehension in equal measure. "What kind of proposition?" "I live in a rather large house about 5 miles outside of town," Daniel explained. "It's comfortable and well appointed, but it's also isolated and challenging to maintain properly. I've been looking for someone to serve as housekeeper and companion for my daughter, who is 12 years old and in need of feminine guidance." Rose stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You're offering me employment, but you don't know anything about me beyond what I've just told you." "I know that you chose homelessness rather than compromise your principles," Daniel replied simply. "I know that you've maintained your dignity despite desperate circumstances. I know that you're educated, articulate, and clearly accustomed to managing a household." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "And I know that you're brave enough to walk into the silver dollar looking for work, which suggests you're not easily intimidated by challenging situations." Rose felt tears gather in her eyes at the unexpected kindness in his words. "But what if I'm not suitable? What if your daughter doesn't like me or I can't manage the household to your standards? Then we'll part company amicably, and I'll provide you with sufficient funds to establish yourself elsewhere," Daniel said without hesitation. "But I have a feeling that won't be necessary. There's something about you, Mrs. Murphy, that suggests you're exactly what our household needs." Rose looked around the empty street, thinking of the church pew that awaited her if she declined this offer, of the dwindling coins in her purse, of the complete absence of any other prospects on her horizon. Then she looked back at Daniel Thornton, this stranger who had appeared at her darkest moment offering hope when she had none left. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I would be very grateful for the opportunity." Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. "Excellent. I have a carriage at the livery stable. If you're ready, we can head out to the house tonight, or if you prefer, I can arrange accommodation in town and we can make the journey in the morning." Rose thought of the stares and whispers that would follow her if she remained in town another night, of the humiliation of her ejection from the silver dollar spreading through the small community like wildfire. Tonight would be preferable, if it's not too much trouble. The carriage ride through the mountain darkness was unlike anything Rose had ever experienced. Daniel proved to be an excellent conversationalist, asking thoughtful questions about her background while sharing information about his own life and circumstances. She learned that he was a widower who had moved to Colorado 5 years earlier to establish his mining operations, bringing his daughter Sarah with him after his wife's death in childbirth. "Sarah is spirited," Daniel said with obvious affection and slight exasperation. "She's intelligent and curious and absolutely fearless, which makes her a wonderful companion, but also a considerable challenge. She's been essentially raised by men, myself, my foreman, the cook, and while we've done our best, she needs someone who can teach her things we simply don't know how to address." "What kinds of things?" Rose asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Social graces, domestic skills, the kinds of knowledge that will help her navigate society as she grows older," Daniel replied. "She can ride and shoot and hold her own in any conversation about mining or business, but she can't sew a straight seam or plan a proper meal or, well, behave like a young lady when the situation requires it." Rose smiled at his description, already forming a mental picture of a girl raised in the freedom of the mountains, but lacking the refinements that society would expect of her as she matured. She sounds delightful and challenging. Both, Daniel agreed with a laugh. I hope you're prepared for a very different kind of household than what you're accustomed to. The Thornton house, when they reached it near midnight, proved to be both impressive and welcoming. Built of local stone and timber, it sprawled across a natural terrace with views of the valley below and the peaks beyond. Warm light spilled from several windows, and Rose could see that despite the late hour, someone had been watching for their arrival. Sarah Thornton burst through the front door before the carriage had fully stopped, her long dark hair flying loose around her shoulders, and her face bright with curiosity. She was indeed a striking child, tall for her age, with her father's intelligent eyes and a vitality that seemed to radiate from her compact frame. "Papa!" she called out, running to the carriage without bothering to put on a coat despite the mountain chill. "You didn't tell me you were bringing someone home?" "Sarah," Daniel said with fond exasperation as he helped Rose down from the carriage. "This is Mrs. Murphy. She's going to be helping us manage the household and other things." Sarah studied Rose with the direct gaze of a child who had grown up among adults and was accustomed to making her own assessments of people. "You're very pretty," she announced after a moment, "and you look sad. Are you running away from something?" "Sarah!" Daniel's voice carried sharp reproach, but Rose held up a hand to forestall any lecture. "It's all right," she said, meeting Sarah's curious gaze directly. "I'm not running away from something exactly. I'm running towards something new which is scary and hopeful at the same time." Sarah considered this answer with obvious approval. "I like that better than running away. Running toward things is braver." She extended a small hand to Rose with formal courtesy that sat oddly on her otherwise informal manner. "Welcome to our house, Mrs. Murphy. I hope you'll like it here." Rose shook the offered hand solemnly. "I hope so too, Sarah. And please, call me Rose." The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior, but Rose was struck by how clearly it reflected a household run by men with little attention to the domestic details that made a house feel like a home. The furniture was good quality, but arranged without thought for comfort or aesthetic appeal. The rooms were clean but lacked the touches: flowers, books arranged by interest rather than size, cushions positioned for actual use rather than display, that would have made them welcoming. "Mrs. Chen, our cook, has prepared a room for you," Daniel explained as he led Rose up a wide staircase to the second floor. "She's Chinese, and while her English is limited, she's an excellent cook and has been invaluable in managing the household. She'll be pleased to have another woman around to help with feminine mysteries." Rose's room proved to be large and comfortable, with a view of the mountains and furniture that, while simple, was well made and pleasant. Someone, presumably Mrs. Chen, had placed fresh flowers on the dresser and turned back the quilt on the bed in a gesture of welcome that made Rose feel tears threaten again. "We'll discuss specific arrangements in the morning," Daniel said as he prepared to leave her to rest. "But I want you to know, Rose, that this is your home now, not just your place of employment. I hope you'll feel free to make whatever changes you think necessary to improve our domestic situation." After he left, Rose sat on the edge of the bed and tried to absorb the dramatic change in her circumstances. 12 hours ago, she had been facing homelessness and complete destitution. Now she found herself in a comfortable room, in a beautiful house, employed by a man who seemed to value her principles rather than condemning them, responsible for a child who appeared both challenging and charming. The next morning brought Rose's first real introduction to the unique challenges of the Thornton household. Sarah appeared at breakfast wearing boys' clothing, her hair in a practical braid, ready to accompany her father on his rounds of the mining operation. Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman with shrewd eyes and limited English, communicated primarily through gestures and the occasional carefully chosen word, but managed to convey both welcome and relief at Rose's presence. "Sarah usually comes with me to the mine," Daniel explained as they shared breakfast in the large kitchen. "She's learning the business, and I like having her nearby where I can keep an eye on her activities." Rose watched Sarah demolish a stack of pancakes with the appetite of someone who intended to spend the day in physical activity. "What about her education? Does she have tutoring or attend school in town?" "I've been teaching her myself," Daniel replied. "Mathematics, geography, history, literature. She's quite advanced for her age. But there are gaps in her education that I'm not qualified to address." "What kinds of gaps?" Rose asked, though she suspected she already knew. Sarah looked up from her breakfast with obvious interest in the conversation. Papa means I don't know how to be a lady, she said matter-of-factly. I can calculate all yields and negotiate with suppliers, but I can't dance or play piano or make polite conversation about things that don't matter. Rose smiled at the girl's direct assessment. And do you want to learn those things? Sarah considered the question seriously. I want to learn everything I can learn. Papa says knowledge is power, and I want to have as much power as possible. In that case, Rose said, making a decision that felt both natural and momentous, perhaps we can work out an arrangement where you spend mornings with your father learning business and afternoons with me learning other things. Daniel's expression showed both relief and gratitude. That sounds ideal. What did you have in mind for these afternoon lessons? Rose looked around the kitchen, noting the functional but uninspired arrangements, then back at Sarah's eager face. I think we'll start with practical domestic skills, cooking, sewing, household management, but we'll also work on music, literature, social graces, and anything else Sarah wants to explore. Over the following weeks, Rose threw herself into transforming not just Sarah's education, but the entire atmosphere of the Thornton household. She worked with Mrs. Chen to reorganize the kitchen for greater efficiency, rearranged furniture throughout the house to create more comfortable and attractive living spaces, and established routines that brought order and warmth to what had been a purely functional environment. But it was her work with Sarah that proved most rewarding. The girl was indeed remarkably intelligent, absorbing new skills with enthusiasm, and asking questions that often challenged Rose to think more deeply about the subjects she was teaching. More importantly, Sarah seemed to understand intuitively that learning feminine accomplishments didn't require abandoning her interests in business and outdoor activities. I don't see why I can't know how to calculate profit margins and how to plan a dinner party, Sarah observed one afternoon as they worked on menu planning. They're both about organization and attention to detail. They absolutely are, Rose agreed, marveling at the girl's ability to find connections between seemingly disparate skills. And the more things you understand, the more tools you have for solving whatever problems you encounter. Daniel seemed equally pleased with the changes Rose was bringing to their household. He had fallen into the habit of spending evenings in the parlor with Rose and Sarah, reading or working on correspondence, while they pursued their various projects. The conversations that arose during these quiet hours were unlike anything Rose had experienced. Wide-ranging discussions of current events, philosophical questions, and practical problems that treated all three participants as intellectual equals. You've transformed this place, Daniel told Rose one evening after Sarah had retired to bed, and they sat enjoying the peace of the mountain night. It feels like a home now, rather than just a house where men happen to live. Rose looked around the parlor, noting the small improvements she had made, books arranged by topic, cushions positioned for comfort, flowers from the wild mountain meadows arranged in simple vases. It just needed someone to pay attention to the details that make a place welcoming. It needed you, Daniel corrected gently. Sarah has never been happier. Mrs. Chen has someone to help her communicate with the outside world, and He paused, then continued with obvious sincerity. I had forgotten how pleasant it could be to come home to a place where someone cared about my comfort and well-being. Rose felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, followed immediately by a flutter of anxiety. Over the weeks, she had become increasingly aware that her feelings for Daniel were evolving beyond those appropriate for an employer and employee. She looked forward to their evening conversations, found herself paying attention to his preferences in food and domestic arrangements, and felt a satisfaction in his approval that went beyond professional pride. Daniel, she said carefully, I need you to know how grateful I am for this opportunity. You saved my life when you offered me this position, and I don't want to do anything that would jeopardize what we've built here. Daniel studied her face in the lamplight, his expression serious. What are you worried about jeopardizing, Rose? Rose felt her cheeks burn as she struggled to find words for feelings she wasn't sure she should be having. I'm concerned that my growing fondness for this household, for Sarah, for you, might be inappropriate given my position here. And what would make it inappropriate? Daniel asked quietly. I'm your employee, Rose said, though even as she spoke the words, they felt inadequate to describe the relationship that had developed between them. There are expectations, boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Rose's face to the comfortable room around them, then back to her eyes. Rose, when I offered you this position, I was looking for someone to help me manage my household and guide my daughter. What I found was a woman who has become essential to our happiness and well-being in ways I never anticipated. Rose felt her heart race at the implications of his words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between watching you teach Sarah to waltz and seeing you arrange flowers with the same care you bring to everything else, I fell in love with you." Daniel's voice was steady but soft. "I'm saying that you've become far more than an employee to me, and I hope you might be interested in exploring what that could mean." Rose stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. After months of feeling like damaged goods, a woman whose options had been reduced to charity or compromise, here was someone telling her that she was not just valued but loved. "I love you too," she said simply, the words feeling both natural and revolutionary. "I think I started falling in love with you the night you found me outside the Silver Dollar and offered me hope when I had none left." Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt both intimate and right. "Rose, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything about your security here. Whether you return my feelings or not, whether you're interested in exploring a romantic relationship or not, you and Sarah will always have a place in this household." Rose felt tears gather in her eyes at his consideration for her independence and security. "And I want you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with gratitude or dependence. I love you, Daniel Thornton, not because you rescued me, but because of who you are. The man who values his daughter's intelligence enough to let her learn about business, who treats his employees with respect, who saw something worth saving in a woman thrown out of a saloon for having too much pride." Their courtship, once acknowledged, unfolded with the natural ease of two people who had already built a foundation of friendship and mutual respect. Daniel proved to be thoughtful and patient, understanding that Rose needed time to trust in her new security, to believe that happiness was something she was allowed to claim rather than something that would be taken away when she least expected it. Sarah, when informed of the developing relationship between her father and Rose, was delighted. "Does this mean Rose will be my mother?" she asked with characteristic directness. "If she'll have us," Daniel replied, smiling at Rose's expression of pleased surprise. "Would you like that?" "Very much," Sarah said solemnly. "I've never had a mother, but if I were going to choose one, I would choose Rose." Their wedding took place 6 months later, in the parlor of their mountain home, with Pastor Williams officiating and a small gathering of friends from town and the mining operation in attendance. Sarah served as maid of honor, wearing a dress she and Rose had sewn together as part of her domestic education. As Rose and Daniel exchanged vows, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the depths of despair outside the Silver Dollar to this moment of joy and new beginning. She had been cast out for refusing to compromise her principles, only to discover that maintaining those principles had led her to something far better than anything she could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, as they danced their first dance to music Sarah was providing on the piano she had been learning to play. "I'm thinking about choices," Rose replied, looking into the eyes of the man who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself. "How sometimes the things that feel like disasters are actually doors opening to possibilities we never knew existed." Daniel spun her around their improvised dance floor, and Rose laughed with pure joy. Around them, their friends and family celebrated not just a wedding, but the creation of something new, a household built on love and respect, and the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones that came together through choice rather than birth. In the years that followed, Rose and Daniel built more than just a successful marriage. They built a community. Their home became a gathering place for neighbors, a refuge for people facing difficult circumstances, and an example of what was possible when people chose to see opportunity rather than obligation in their relationships with others. Sarah grew into a remarkable young woman who combined her father's business acumen with her stepmother's social graces, eventually taking over the mining operation and expanding it into one of the most successful enterprises in the territory. She never forgot the lessons she had learned about the importance of maintaining principles, even when it seemed easier to compromise, and she became known throughout the region for her fair treatment of workers and her support for women seeking greater independence. When Rose died at the age of 71, her funeral filled the largest church in the county, and overflow crowds gathered outside to honor the woman who had touched so many lives. Former employees spoke of her fairness and kindness. Community leaders acknowledged her role in establishing schools and charitable institutions. Business associates praised her intelligence and integrity. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Sarah, now a successful businesswoman and mother of 4, who spoke of a woman who had taught her that strength could be gentle and that the greatest victories were often achieved by refusing to surrender one's principles, even when the cost seemed unbearable. My stepmother came into our lives because she chose dignity over desperation, Sarah told the assembled crowd. She was thrown out of a saloon for refusing to dance, and that refusal led her to our door and changed all our lives for the better. She taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is say no to what we cannot accept, because that no creates space for the yes we've been waiting for. She paused, her voice growing stronger as she continued. Rose showed me that a woman could be both principled and practical, that love could grow from respect as much as passion, and that the families we choose can be just as strong as the ones we're born into. She proved that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning, and that our greatest blessings often come disguised as our worst disasters. The small mining town where Rose had once stood homeless and rejected eventually grew into a thriving city, but the story of the woman who had been kicked out of the Silver Dollar for refusing to dance became part of local legend. Visitors would often be told about Rose Thornton, who had maintained her principles in desperate circumstances and had found love and security as a result. And in the house on the mountain terrace where Rose and Daniel had built their life together, now home to Sarah's own family, the story was passed down through generations as proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the words, "I won't," and that the courage to refuse what we cannot accept is often the first step toward finding what we've been seeking all along.